We're going to take a deep dive into emissions and how it has affected our trucking industry and where this whole thing might be headed. So let's get started with some basics to get the ball rolling. Right on.
High five.
Okay, so first of all, just who the heck came up with the idea of emissions control?
Believe it or not, President Richard Nixon founded and established a branch of the government and called it the EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Association. And the branch was assigned to do exactly what the name suggests. They were concerned about the mounting levels of pollution, so Nixon established this branch of government to help patrol and control and that type of thing. So the intentions, like a lot of things the government has done, the intentions were honorable, the intentions were good. So the EPA started in 1970 under Richard Nixon. By 1974, they had all their office furniture and everything set up. They were in their high rise, and they decided, well, we better start doing something to justify the funding. So in 1979, the EPA announced that they were going to start by regulating truck emissions, which all sorts of people felt was one of the biggest contributors to pollution. Now, I would have said big steel factories and pulp mills and stuff like that produce far more emissions than trucks, but there were just one whole hell of a lot of trucks on the road, so they decided to start with trucks. And being a branch of the government, the whole program didn't necessarily have to make sense. They just laid out the mandate and expected the engine manufacturers to comply, whether it was possible engineering-wise or not. So they just made the mandate, and they started patrolling. They started checking the trucks in 2002, and by 2004 they had begun their emissions program, and it was built in stages, and it would progress every few years. They'd clamp down a little harder and a little harder every few years. It all started with Nixon's formation of the EPA. Now, many states, California in particular, had their own state branch of the EPA, which everybody knows CARB when they hear it, but that was their California's version of the EPA. So all the states are governed by the EPA, but different states responded in different manners. California, however, has always led the way in following the EPA's lead, and California really now has become the test state for the rest of the country as to what's going to be mandated and what's going to be legal.
So probably then, to back up a little bit, what was the whole idea behind emissions control?
The idea was to reduce pollution from Class 8 trucks, from big heavy trucks, to improve the air quality in the country, in the United States. That was the goal. So they basically needed to make the engine manufacturers cut down on the black smoke that was coming out of the stacks of all the trucks all over the country.
Like in the Lettuce King's truck.
Especially in trucks like the Lettuce King's trucks, for instance. But yeah, that was their task. That was the first thing they tackled, really. And they had other projects on the go as well, but that was one of their big ones, was to reduce emissions from commercial trucks. And they went about it with fervor. So by 2004, the engine manufacturers know that the EPA is serious, and they know that they're going to have to spend some serious money on research and development, because basically they needed to change the way the engine worked. And engines are no different than people. They need to inhale, they need to breathe, and they needed to exhale just as we do as humans. The problem was, though, that the EPA decided, well, the engines can breathe in, but they can't breathe out. And when they breathe out, that's what goes up the stacks. It's unburned fuel or whatever, and carbon monoxide, all sorts of nasty things they didn't want in the air. So they mandated that the truck manufacturers, the engine manufacturers, were going to start squeezing down on what they would allow out of the stacks of the trucks. One of the most stressful parts of any truck driver's day is getting pulled into the weigh station. DriveWise helps eliminate that stress with their pre-clear technology. It works on all major ELDs or as an app on your phone. DriveWise is now offering a 30-day free trial on DriveWise Pre-Clear. Check them out at drivewise.com.
We'll move on to how these regs have adversely affected our trucking industry.
So, the EPA is just a government body, and like most government bodies, they really don't understand the science of what it is they're regulating. They're just an ideological body. They have a goal in mind. They figure this is the best way to reach the goal. This is what we're going to mandate. But the problem was they were mandating something that had more impact on the country than they ever initially realized. They thought it was going to be a simple deal, not nearly as complex as what it would become. And they never once, I don't think, looked down the road and looked at the ramifications of how this was going to affect the national economy and the bigger picture. They didn't look at the bigger picture. They just wanted less smoke out of the stacks. They didn't care how it happened, and they just knew they'd get more funding the more they made it happen. So all of a sudden you've got all these engine manufacturers trying to figure out how to redesign these engines so they don't exhale. And it was an engineering disaster because it affected the way the truck engine worked. But these manufacturers were mandated to this. So by 2007, engine manufacturers were really feeling the pinch. They thought they had a system that was going to work for them using a diesel particulate filter and DEF fluid and this type of thing. They thought they had an engineering system figured out, but the problem was that the system made the truck engines unreliable because they couldn't inhale. They were collecting all this junk in this particulate filter. Didn't know how to get rid of it. They try to burn it off with a regen system. They're trying to cut down on the stack smoke past that filter by shooting DEF fluid or urea onto the smoke or whatever you want to call it, sending it through another filter and hoping what wafts out of the stack that's left at the end of the day is acceptable for the emission standards the EPA has imposed. And truck engine reliability went into the toilet. And not only that, these engine manufacturers, and they all had done this, they all spent millions trying to develop systems to make these engines work under these new emission conditions. They spent millions, and a whole lot of the time they weren't satisfied with the results, no matter how much research and development they did. It just wasn't looking good because the reliability of the engine was just plummeting. And it got to the point by 2010, and the EPA had drawn a line in the sand at 2010, and that was going to be their next round. If you didn't meet the requirements by 2010, they were going to squeeze down and clamp down even more. And Caterpillar basically said, you know what? We don't think that you can make this work. They were suffering. They were like everybody else. They were suffering warranty claims. They were suffering huge downtime. They were suffering lawsuits. And Caterpillar, at that point, bowed right out because they said, you know what? This isn't a viable reality here. It's just not going to happen for us, and we're not going to waste any more time and money on it. So, and that's what happened to Caterpillar. It's affected everybody. And the engines were so unreliable there from about 2009, 2010 onwards that the truck drivers that relied on their trucks to make a living, it's funny how that works, decided they needed workaround solutions. And this really spawned the growth of glider kits and in-framing older trucks and things like that, because the cost of a new truck with all this emissions equipment on had skyrocketed somewhere between an extra 10 and 20 grand on top of the price of what they've been paying for before. In the meantime, the EPA had also mandated that they change the fuel quality. So all of a sudden, instead of making diesel fuel with oil, we're making diesel fuel with corn and soybeans and everything else, which was great for the farmers, but it was not great for the transportation industry because that stuff was unreliable. It gelled. It still does. They still have issues with it, and the filters plug, the engine shut down. So the whole emissions thing has been really destructive. It's been devastating for the trucking industry, but they show no signs of backing off. I think the whole thing was poorly implemented. I think they rushed it. I think if they'd given us, 50 or 75 years to develop the technology, we would have gotten there. But instead, they crammed it down our throats with these deadlines about when these emission standards had to be met, and it devastated the industry.
Daniel Meredith has commented, if a lot of trucks that are burning clean fuel with DEF, but yet a lot of places that you stop at won't let you idle.
Yeah, that's true. And, honestly, they found out that a lot of these emissions engines just plug up when they idle anyway. So it's probably a good thing if you don't idle a motor anymore. But that's not practical for a guy that's living in the truck. I guess you can go out and invest, $5,000 in an APU that may work or may not. But still, it's it speaks to the impracticality of the whole thing. And that's where we have a problem. And California is the state that they've got CARB. They went right along with the EPA. They basically mirrored what the EPA wanted. But the effect on the state of California has been devastating. It's put like small mom and pop trucking companies right out of business because they just couldn't afford to, the new technology. It affected the guys pulling containers out of the yards down there. It affected the produce industry, something huge because and here we're seeing a long-term effect of that now. Here I was looking at produce rates the other day, and produce rates last week from the West Coast to the East Coast of the United States, the average produce load was paying $10,000. And this is in off-season for produce. And the reason for that is because so many small outfits, single guys, independent, small outfits, hauled produce. And now guys like me, and there's thousands and thousands of us, just won't go to California anymore because they don't want the fines, they don't want the hassle. The reefers have to meet emission standards as well. The reefers are shutting off, the produce claims are huge, and a whole segment of our trucking industry just quit going to California because it just wasn't a practical business decision for us to continue to do that anymore. And now they wonder why the produce rates are so high, but that gets passed on to the consumer. So what happens there? Everyone is now going to pay more for groceries. That's the end result of that. And I'm sure the EPA hadn't thought any of that through. Anyway, thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate it. Thanks again for joining us. Take care. Keep the rubber side down, and we'll see you on the backhaul. Good night, everybody.
Good night.